At some point in your lifting career, you've likely been told this thing. And you've likely been told this thing, not just in one context, oftentimes the bench press, but in a multitude of contexts. Rows, pull downs, even lateral raises I've heard people talk about this on. And this is a panacea, or at least it's looked at as a panacea. And what I want to show you all in this video is the reality of this cue and what it actually is and what from a shoulder mechanics perspective actually occurs when the shoulders go back. Because the shoulders don't go back and down, they go back and up. Literally the opposite, at least in the context that we're going to describe here. So first things first, what does shoulders back and up mean? Well, it means what it sounds like, but why does it happen and why is it not back and down? If we think about really what shoulders back is, right? Shoulders back is motion of this whole girdle. Right? So a shoulder is not a joint. It's not one thing. It's not just this ball and socket thing that people think about. It's this plus this bone plus this bone, right? Upper arm plus collarbone plus shoulder blade. And these things move backward and forward together as a unit. That's how they're supposed to move, and that's also why we have so much mobility in the shoulder, is because we can move through these three different places. And so when the shoulders move back, all these things need to move back. By definition, they're connected structurally. And so when we do something like back, we need to not just pay attention to what is happening at this bone, the scapula, the shoulder blade, but also this bone and this bone. And not only those bones, but all the ones that sit underneath of them that define, from a structural constraints perspective, where the shoulder girdle can actually move. So a really helpful perspective to understand this is this one, right? Because if the shoulder moves back, if the shoulder blade moves back, watch what happens to this bone, the clavicle or the collarbone. The clavicle or the collarbone, you see I'm just sliding it along the ribs. I'm just attempting to push back. I'm not intentionally manipulating it up or down. As I push this thing backward, notice what has to happen to the collarbone. The collarbone actually has to move upward, right? And that is specifically because the rib cage, again, the train tracks on top of which the train, so to speak, sits, the rib cage runs at an upward angle. In other words, if I stick this thing in here, if you think about the trajectory through which this collarbone has to travel, if it travels back and down, in other words, in this direction like this, it would just jam into the rib cage. Like the rib cage is underneath of this thing. It literally, if the collarbone were to be able to jam it downward into the rib cage, what would have to happen is these bones would actually have to separate for this to even make contact. But the reason it doesn't make contact is because of this sort of what we would call more proximal or medial aspect of the clavicle, which is just the inside of this bone, you could think of it as. And because the rib cage is egg-shaped, it converges upward like this to a point. So an egg, you know, hopefully all you have seen an egg before, an egg is kind of shaped something like this. The peak of the egg is rounded upward. So when the shoulders go backward, what this means is that they have to simultaneously go upward, the shoulder blades, the clavicles all together. Now, of course, this can change. For example, if your arm is all the way, let's say, in front of your body and your scapula and your clavicle are in a totally different position, yeah, they can go backward and downward based on that relative position. But when people say back and down, not what I've written there, but back and down, they say it in all contexts, and specifically the context where your shoulder blades are actually as far backward as they need to be for a particular motion. So what do people do in a bench press? Well, they pin their shoulder blades back and then they try to pull them down. And we'll talk about sort of why the cue actually works and what it's actually doing as opposed to what people think it's doing. But this is a really important thing to understand, because if you think that the collarbone and the shoulder blade go back and down, and you start doing it across all of your exercises, right, whether it's a press or a pull or something else, then not only are you going to not be able to train the muscles that actually pull the shoulder blade back and up as well, but you may start to run into some issues that I think a lot of people do, just trying to frequently jam this thing downward where it's not supposed to move. And if you needed any sort of other evidence for just the fact that the scapula and the clavicle move back and up, at least again from this position, If you look up the rhomboid muscles, the rhomboid major, the rhomboid minor, they are our primary retractors, and they attach on the inner side of the shoulder blade, and they run into the spine. But they don't run this way downward, back and down. They actually run at an upward angle, kind of like my fingers are oriented right here. And that's because they need to pull the scapula backward and upward, not again backward and downward. So I think it's also important to give credit where credit is due to this cue in terms of the success that it has had, specifically in powerlifting populations and specifically in bench pressing movements. So why do powerlifters like to use this cue? Well, let's think about it this way. If the shoulder blades can't, from this position, actually move back and down, what happens if we cue backward, but then we also think downward, right? Because a cue isn't exactly meant to be this one-to-one, I'm imagining the exact reality of the situation and I'm matching an intent with it. It's more just like I'm creating an intent and my bones and my joints are gonna do whatever they're gonna do as a consequence of that. So if the shoulder blades move back, again, what you'll notice is if they're actually going back, they're moving backward and upward. And then you in your head think down. What actually happens when you think down? Well, your shoulder blades don't move down, and if they move at all, they're just gonna move outward because you're cueing the downward thing. But what does happen, and just do this naturally, see what happens when you cue back and down, is your spine actually extends. Right, so what does that look like? Well, it just looks like pulling your rib cage into this more arched position, right? So the scapulas actually move backward and upward, as we mentioned, and then they stay there, people pin them there, as their entire rib cage gets pulled upward, i.e. arching the back. So what people do in a bench press, they pull their scaps back and up, and then they spinal extend, right? Back and up, spinal extension. So in other words, what this cue really does for powerlifters is it improves their ability to arch. And improving the ability to arch in the context of a max effort bench press oftentimes is associated with adding more load, or at least the appearance of more strength. And so this has become a widespread cue specifically because it does work in specific contexts, but problems will start to occur if you take the cue, number one, as literal, right? As literal meaning your shoulder blades actually need to move back and down because, as we discussed, the reality is the opposite, back and up. But in addition, if you remove the cue from the original context within which it had its benefit, and you all of a sudden apply it to rows, pull downs, lateral raises, you're gonna end up doing all sorts of things that per each individual context make no sense. Let me just give one example. That people will literally say, pin your shoulder blades back and down. Again, we discussed the problems with that during a lateral raise, where your shoulders literally need to upwardly rotate out of that position. And so people are trying to pin their scaps in a particular position on across all exercises almost, at least some people. I know I used to do that when I first got into lifting. And repeating that same sort of strategy across all your exercises, again, is not a good idea, right? It would almost be, in some ways, it's a little bit of a silly comparison, but it would be like if you were doing a biceps curl, and while you were doing the biceps curl, you were also thinking about contracting your triceps, right? Those actions in the context of a lateral raise are the opposite actions that you would actually want to encourage. Right? In a lateral raise example, you want to let your scapula move. It needs to upwardly rotate along with the arm so that the arm can travel wherever it needs to travel up in this sort of higher space of what we would call shoulder flexion or shoulder abduction, abduction. So overall, it's not that the cue is bad. It's just that, number one, it doesn't reflect the reality of what is occurring in the shoulder and the shoulder complex as the scapulas move as far backward as they can, backward and upward. And number two, if you remove the cue from the original context in which it was beneficial, again, in the context of a powerlifting bench press, back and down really is just code for let me arch my spine and make sure my scaps are at least starting in a position where they can get backward, right? Because think about it, if you have a bench here and you're compressing your back against the bench, you need to be able to actually start with your scapulas at least to some degree backward, because if you don't, it might be actually hard to get them back there as you lower the bar. So the cues work in that particular context for very specific reasons, again, that are only specific to that context. You remove that context, you remove the importance of those intentions in that context, and now all of a sudden we're dealing with something completely different. So if any of you have questions about the shoulder mechanics, how it might apply, when it might apply, feel free to ask, drop a comment. But all in all, if you're doing rows especially, and you're actually trying to train this fully retracted position, scaps back and up, not back and down. Are you someone that wants to be able to target any muscle in your body when you're lifting, but you also don't give a shit about complicated anatomy and biomechanics? If you are, then this is the perfect ebook for you. The Target Any Muscle ebook is not really an ebook. It's more like a lifetime cheat sheet guide to lifting. You need a total of 0 understanding of anatomy and biomechanics to understand this material. And that's because every chapter is full of tons of different diagrams and very visual, simple explanations about how to set up an exercise for any muscle. In addition, every chapter functions as a standalone guide, so you can simply click on the table of contents and navigate to any muscle group that you're training on any given day. Every single chapter includes visuals of how to stretch any muscle, how to shorten any muscle, how to load any muscle, and then how to stabilize your body so that you can train that muscle appropriately. And in addition, at the end of every chapter, there's a training FAQ to address commonly asked questions and a full video lecture summarizing each chapter with me and my skeleton model to demonstrate. This is meant to function as a cheat sheet for life. This should be the last product that you ever purchase about how to lift. I hope you all enjoy the guide. Happy gains.